Hello, everyone, and welcome to Books by Youth Climate Activists. We encourage you to live chat on YouTube with our presenters and participants. You can find the link to these sessions' live YouTube page at gathering.theedcollab.com. I am so pleased to welcome our next presenter, Sochi Bentley.
Thank you so much, Markeisha. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon. I'm a high school English teacher. I'm an author of a forthcoming book called Helping Students Become Climate Stewards. And thinking about books written by youth climate activists is a topic near and dear to my heart. So today I'll talk about four of these activists for these books so we can kind of zoom in and think about, how chock full of goodness they are one by one. But I just love them as a constellation of texts you could conceivably look at together in a course. They're just a great text set. So I'm someone who spends a lot of time in environmental organization spaces. And when I talk to people in these spaces, we often talk about, what or who inspires us. And I will say almost always someone shares a name of a youth climate activist. And it's just not surprising to me. These activists, they can raise awareness without relying on jargon to convey their talking points. They frequently participate in strikes, and this can invite heckling and bullying, and yet they persist. And I think today, the books I want to explore with you, they also overlap with my interests in coming of age stories. So with this focus, I'm interested in their own words. What do they understand to be those key moments and core memories that shape their journey to maturation? And how does the stories they tell, how do they invite other young people to be engaged and participate in climate stewardship and environmental justice? So the first book I want to talk about is Jamie Margolin's Youth to Power, Your Voice and How to Use It. And Jamie describes writing this book when she was trying to survive high school in Seattle, Washington. And she says that no one really tells you how to become a change maker. Like no one says at the beginning, this is how it's going to go. So she wanted this book to be super practical, and she wanted to be honest with other young people about the good and the bad of being an activist. So one of her major motivations for writing this was to say, hey, you might be at the beginning stages of your activism. This is how it could go. And here are some look fors, and here are some things to avoid. And so I love this book, and part of her backstory is she was asking local policymakers to just engage in some common sense action in her community. And as she watched them listening to her, she recognized that they didn't respect her voice because she was a young person. And it really fueled her desire to begin a climate organization. So she founded 0 Hour, which is a global climate justice organization. And it was actually the organization that was responsible for the Youth Climate March in Washington, D.C. in 2018, as well as organizing the marches in 25 sister cities across the globe. So hugely impactful. And when she thinks about this journey, she's very honest that it was fraught with like failure and zigzags. It wasn't just this upward trajectory of success. So it's really humanizing, and it makes this journey of activism seem accessible. I also love the practical things she includes in this book, such as examples of op-eds she's written. And while she shares them, she's very honest that I got a lot of rejection letters for things I tried to publish and pitch. She includes a decision making diagram to help people collaborate with teams. And she does this stressing that you don't need to look at other environmental organizations as your rivals, that if you think of an ecosystem, there's mutually beneficial relationships you can have with other organizations that help you grow your movement, that help you advance your cause. So it's really, really reassuring. I think that she does a great job of stressing the perception of young people and movements. So she tells us what you could be up against. And she says, systematic silencing of your voice. People think you lack credibility. You might, you often will lack funding and resources. But she also stresses the power you have as a young person. You don't have to worry about special interests, that you have the moral high ground. No one is looking for in your record how you are a hypocrite as you call out other leaders. She says that you bring fresh energy and perspectives. And she says that don't forget, you have expertise on those topics that personally affect you. And I think that's really, really important that she talks about what we've learned from our own lived experience. We bring expertise to every conversation we have. So I think it's such a practical, useful book, an entry point for activism. And I think, if we're thinking about how we plot coming of age stories, she helps us think about it as squaring the person you are in the present with that person you wish to become. And she says that if you stay connected to your why, that you will stay your course. So it's just really, really helpful and practical. The next book I want to talk about was written by Ugandan activist Vanessa Nakate. And where she lives in Eastern Africa, Vanessa talks about how there's this higher incidence of temperatures being very extreme, more flooding, more landslides. And she notes that while media focuses its attention elsewhere, she wanted to develop a platform drawing attention to the impact of the climate crisis in the global south. And so to that end, she began protesting alone outside Uganda's parliament. And she really was drawing attention to the government lack of action for climate issues. Even though she was protesting alone for about 3 months, she noticed that more and more young people were responding to her call to actions on social media. And these people eventually founded the Youth for Future Africa movement. So the title of this book alludes to a really horrible moment where the Associated Press cropped out Vanessa from a photograph where she was posing with other activists. So this was at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland in January 2019 or 2020, actually. And she, looking at the photograph, finds it impossible to ignore that, like these activists, she was there to urge the attendees of this economic conference to take the climate crisis seriously. And she goes, I'm the only one. I'm not European. I'm not white. And it was a really horrible moment where she was victimized by racism in the media. And so she talks about this moment in her book, about how it taught her about erasure in the environmental movement and erasure in the media. And not just individual erasure, but collective erasure. She talks about how they didn't just crop me out, they cropped out an entire continent. At the press conference where that photograph was taken, she was the only climate activist from Uganda. She was the only climate activist from Africa. And so you can see that this moment really structures the overall design of this book. She'll frequently say, something was wrong with this picture, or she'll say, we need to recognize those voices that have been historically left out, that they've been left out of the picture. I think that what's so powerful about this book is that she teaches us exactly what the goal of environmental justice is, which is that we should have equal protection from environmental hazards and public health emergencies. And so she says, and she said this in her video response to the cropping of the photo as well, is that Africa is the least emitter of carbons, but the continent most impacted by climate change impacts. And so though there were barriers to her striking, she had to overcome her innate shyness. She had to deal with social stigmas attached to young women demonstrating in public. She persisted because she realized she wasn't just raising awareness, she was pushing for needed, ambitious systemic change. So it's hugely inspirational. And I think it's the first book I recommend to my students when they think about young activists. And I think it also raises two big questions. So, how do these first person narratives articulate barriers to participating in advocacy and in solutions that our own students recognize? And I think it also raises the question, how does a coming of age story written by a climate activist, how does it offer a striking example of place-based storytelling? I learned so much about Uganda and Eastern Africa from reading this. So it's really, really educational and moving. The next book I want to talk about is written by Dara McAnulty, The Diary of a Young Naturalist. And this book has a really interesting structure. It is written in diary form from spring equinox to spring equinox, from his 14th birthday to his 15th birthday. And he's chronicling his family's move from Western North Ireland in County Fermanagh to the eastern edge of Northern Ireland in County Down. And he describes how at a young age he was diagnosed with autism and Asperger's. And in fact, he is 4 of the 5 members of his family are non-neurotypical. The prose of this is very poetic and shows a lot of reverence for nature. As you read it, you feel as a reader that you're being drawn into communion with insects, with plant life, and above all, with the birds of Northern Ireland. And he speaks very candidly about how this move from west to this new home in the east, it prompts a psychological crisis for him. He finds change really difficult, and being apart from all those favorite local nature spots, it feels like a wound to him. I think that a really interesting part of this book is found in an August entry, where he's talking about tuning into the bird calls that robins are making as they visit a bird feeder while he's watching from a hammock. And he says, we all have a place in our world, our own small corner, and we need to notice it and tend it with grace and compassion. And he says, maybe this could be mine in County Downs. My small corner is this place where I can think thoughts and watch birds and just sway gently in this hammock. And I love this, and I often show this part of this book to my students because I think it's so instructive for identifying your own small corner from which you can develop a habit of noticing. And asking your students, how does developing and consciously cultivating a habit of observation in the outdoors, how does that make you feel a deeper sense of connection? How does that encourage a sense of kinship with non-human beings? So it's very beautiful. I think the words themselves give you this sense of nature immersion. And I'm just really glad I came across it. The next book I want to talk about is We Rise by Shutezcott Martinez. And I think this is the first book I read by a young climate activist. And I actually think it's when I almost when I began teaching high school English, so early on. And Shutezcott is a climate warrior and hip hop artist of indigenous Mexican descent. He is a youth director of the Earth Guardians, which is a global organization of musicians, artists, and activists. And he wrote this book at the age of 17. And he has been protesting since the age of 6. And he, at the age of 15, memorially gave an address to the General Assembly of the United Nations, where he spoke in Spanish, English, and Nahuatl. And I think two things I really want to highlight about his advocacy is his emphasis on the role of music, as well as his emphasis on intergenerational awareness. And so he says that it's been music that's been the biggest tool in helping the Earth Guardians send their message across the globe. And he says when he creates music that he really tries to think about how a person will feel the song, not just listen to it. And he says that it's so important to think about what your relationship with music is, because he believes music is what gives us the impression that we're all in this together. So rather than maybe caring so much about climate activism, but feeling alone or depressed or burned out, you can really go to music reliably as a go-to that will help you feel that sense of connection, that sense of community. And he also, again, has this emphasis on intergenerational awareness. He often recalls the words his father taught him, which is, at the least, we can leave flowers. At the least, we can leave songs. And so throughout the book, he's asking us to consider, what kind of legacy do you want to leave? What kind of legacy do we want to leave? And, he describes that he feels that on our focus on progress and growth and development, we have forgotten who we are, and that the way we can recover this absent sense of connection is by looking back to ancient teachings and learning knowledge from our elders. He says this is the means of reconnection. And I think it's really important because he's ultimately advocating for a balance, like to really shape a future that's habitable and livable. We can't just focus on media and innovation and technology, but we need to balance it with our contact with indigenous wisdom. Something that I think is important and really powerful that he says later on in the book is that he advocates for authentic spirituality and not cultural appropriation. He says that he knows that a lot of people are spiritually hungry, but that he really urges respect when trying to engage in spiritual practices that are not your own. And so I think the structure of this book is very similar to Jamie Margolin's, in that it's occasionally punctuated with interviews with other climate activists and people who inspire him. And it's just really, really lovely and chock full of information. So I think if you take these 4 books together, this can be the great start of doing a deep dive in climate activism with our youth perspective. I think for me, whenever I'm feeling disillusioned or disenchanted about climate inaction, I look to our young people, particularly people who have participated in these marches and these strikes, because they're so courageous. And they do these things at great personal risk, but they understand what the stakes are. And I think that if you look at these books, you can think of their experiences as those acts of rehearsal that help you understand how you can engage. So thinking about how they could be used in the classroom, um, I think structuring speeches, structuring op-eds. Something I've done with students is have them look at excerpts and say, what might be a sentence or a passage that would be a great mentor text for our own advocacy, and have them choosing those excerpts for their peers. I also think, reflecting on what all these activists say is that burnout is something you always need to be attentive to, the possibility of burnout. And I think we in education recognize that warning is something that needs to be heeded. It's very, very hard to fill your cup when you're so exhausted from all the duties of being at school sites. And I think these reminders definitely apply to our professional work, where so much of our mental labor and emotional labor is intertwined, that you need to find ways to take care of yourself. And that's something I love that all four of these writers talk about. I am risking tremendous burnout right now. What can I do to take care of myself? This is who I talk to. This is the music I listen to. This is the spot in nature I spend more time in. So they're all inspiring and all really unique coming of age stories. And just the last thing I want to say is, all of them, their life stories thus far show us a multiplying effect. For example, Vanessa was protesting alone, but then her friends were inspired by her example, and the people on social media noticed what she was doing, and so on. And so in that moment, you may feel very small or isolated, but there is this multiplying effect with environmental action that I think really, really builds community far beyond what's visible to you. And I think that we see all these voices engaging what Chris was talking about this morning, not just fighting against, but knowing what you're fighting for and advocating on behalf of and whom. So they're all so powerful.
Thank you so much. Thank you for highlighting the youth on a day where we as adults are focusing on our fight for students. think that was really, really powerful. Thank you for sharing those four titles. For everyone watching, just a reminder, the gathering has always been a free event. And if you feel inspired by this session, and I know you absolutely feel that way right now, we ask that you visit our charity page and pay the joy forward. We have two upcoming sessions, and I will share that you could attend Teaching for Students, Honoring BIPOC Voices in the Classroom and Beyond, or you could attend Books as Pathways, Wandering, Wondering, and Wayfaring. So thank you so, so much for being here today. And if you are still wondering which session you're going to, you can find the schedule at thegathering.theedcollab.com. Enjoy the rest of your day.